Kia ora team. So I thought I would try and complete a video that I've been working on for a long time. So it was this little chat that I wanted to have about the role of nitrogen in agriculture and what it is and what we do with it and what the problems are and how we can solve those problems. Now I've made this video numerous times and it's really never come out the way that I wanted, but I think I've got a plan. So what we're going to do is we're going to split it into basically three subtopics. So the first is, what is nitrogen, what does it do, and where does it come from? And then we'll come back and we'll talk about what are the problems with it. So how does the nitrogen in our agricultural systems cause environmental degradation? And then the third one I'd like to do is a quick talk about what farmers are doing and what more they can do to minimise or to repair that environmental degradation. So let's kick off. So what is nitrogen? Well, it's a gas. It's an element. Hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, maybe? I might edit that bit out. Really abundant. I believe it's 78% of the atmosphere. Floats around, and in elemental form, nitrogen's reasonably a non-event. Why it's important is because all animal life is sort of based on protein, and protein is based on amino acids, and the real heart of an amino acid is the amine group, and the amine group has nitrogen in it. So the way that amino acids link together to form chains is by linking I think it's a nitrile and a carboxyl group together to make a chain, and then if you imagine you've got a big long chain with bits glued onto the side of it, little branching bits like sort of little antlers sticking out the side, and when you fold that chain up, all those antlers sort of interact with each other and you end up with a specific shape, and that specific shape is the shape of the protein, and the shape of the protein sort of determines its function or its ability to function. So some protein is structural, so it makes up skin and hair and muscle and bone and those sorts of things. Some protein has other functions, so it can be like a messenger, so basically a hormone. Insulin's a good example of that, so it takes a message from one part of the body to another, and it has a specific shape that allows it to do that. Some proteins are part of, they have other functions, so they're part of the immune system. They do things like carry oxygen around the body. So protein's really important. But they form the little gateways on the outside of cells that allow certain things in or pump certain things out. So protein's really, really important. Now, as a sheep and beef farmer, primarily beef, that's what I do. I farm protein. To a lesser degree, I sell fat, lipids, but protein's my bread and butter, if you will. So all the protein in my animals comes from the plants they eat. Now, it actually comes indirectly. So cows eat grass, they chew it up, and then they feed it to a vat of bacteria living in their gut, and those bacteria muck around with it, and then the cows live on the bodies of the bacteria. So cows are, in a weird kind of way, are bacteriovores. They live primarily on bacteria. Very little of the plant material is just directly absorbed into the cow. It's all mediated by the bacteria. So anyway, the protein that I sell has to come from plants originally, and plants, to produce protein from scratch, they need a source of nitrate. Right? So most plants can't produce their own nitrate, so they have to absorb what's available in the soil. But there are a group of plants that farm bacteria in a similar way to what cows are doing. They farm some bacteria and they rely on the bacteria to provide them with nitrate. So those plants are called legumes, and legumes have a head start in hungry soils, right? So if you've got a soil that all the nitrogen, all the nitrate has been gobbled up by other plants, legumes, with their source of their own nitrate, have a competitive advantage because they're not limited by what's available in the soil because they're pumping out their own. So in New Zealand, the primary legume we use is white clover. So white clover is a really big part of our pastures. So most pastures in New Zealand are white clover and perennial ryegrass. There are other versions, and even in a perennial ryegrass and white clover pasture, there will be numerous other species. Some of them planted deliberately, some of them leftovers from previous pastures, some of them weeds. So there's a whole smorgasbord of plants there. But the real horsepower comes from our perennial ryegrass and white clover. So the vast majority of the nitrogen in the system that we're dealing with in New Zealand comes, I guess you'd say, inverted commas, naturally, comes from a plant. However, the problem with white clover, or a problem with white clover, is that it doesn't provide, or the rhizobia don't really work at low ground temperatures. So there's a reasonable chunk of the year in New Zealand where the ryegrass could grow if it had more available nitrogen, but the clover is basically shut up shop for the winter, and so there's nothing left for the ryegrass. And so in those scenarios, lots of farmers will use, again, we'll say inverted commas, we'll call it synthetic nitrogen. In New Zealand, the vast majority of nitrogen is applied as one of two fertilisers. One would be urea. So urea is, I'll put up a graphic of the structure of it. I can't remember it off the top of my head. That's really, really common. It's in New Zealand, it's mostly a byproduct of oil and gas exploration. So the gas comes out of the ground and it's full of ammonia, and that has to be scrubbed out because it's damaging to all the equipment. So they scrub it out and then they convert it to urea, which is quite useful. The other main nitrogen source would be diammonium phosphate. That's used that's another fertiliser source. I don't know exactly where diammonium phosphate comes from. I think a lot of ours comes from China, but who knows. And so both of those are the sort of synthetic sources, but the vast majority is coming out of a plant, coming from legume sources. There's a few other sort of ways that it can get introduced into the system. So lightning's a really interesting one. Apparently every lightning strike is worth a reasonable chunk of nitrogen into your system. I don't quite understand the mechanism there, but maybe somebody could help us. And imported feed is another quite common source. So you hear about dairy farmers bringing in palm kernel. Well, palm kernel is a relatively high protein feed, and so as a result, you're bringing nitrogen into the system. So hopefully that's a bit of an explanation of what nitrogen is, how it gets here, and why we need it. And we'll come back to you and we'll have a yarn about what are the problems that nitrogen can cause in our systems and in the environment.